Grace Mitchell clutched her boarding pass, anxiety rising as she shuffled through the crowded first-class cabin. At 5 months pregnant, her back ached from standing in the security line for over an hour. This last-minute business trip to Chicago wasn't ideal timing, but as the lead architect on the Riverside Tower project, she couldn't afford to miss the emergency meeting called by the developer. "Excuse me," she murmured, sliding past a flight attendant. Her gaze fixed on seat 3A, window seat, thank God. The gentle swell of her belly nudged against the seat in front as she maneuvered into her row. Grace settled into the plush leather seat with a relieved sigh, resting one hand protectively over her stomach. She'd barely fastened her seatbelt when a tall figure stopped beside her row. Grace looked up and froze. Standing there, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, was Jackson Reed, billionaire CEO of Reed Enterprises and, unfortunately, the owner of the development company she was flying to meet. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, recognition flickering in his steel blue eyes. "What a coincidence." Grace managed a polite smile. "Mr. Reed, I didn't realize you'd be on this flight." Last-minute decision. He settled into the seat beside her, his broad shoulders taking up more than his fair share of space. The subtle scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something citrusy, filled the air between them. Jackson Reed was a legend in the real estate world, brilliant, ruthless and notoriously demanding. At 36, he'd transformed his father's modest construction company into a billion-dollar empire. He was also, Grace reluctantly admitted to herself, unfairly handsome, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and a jawline that could cut glass. "How far along are you?" he asked, nodding toward her bump. 5 months, Grace replied, surprised by the personal question. "My sister just had her second. A boy." A small smile softened his usually stern expression. "I'm hoping to make it to Chicago and back before my nephew's christening this weekend." The unexpected glimpse of his personal life caught Grace off guard. In the 3 business meetings they'd had previously, Jackson had been all sharp edges and critical questions about her architectural designs. "I didn't know you had a sister," she said. "I have 2, both younger." He loosened his tie slightly. "Are you hoping for a boy or girl?" Grace hesitated. She rarely discussed her pregnancy with anyone besides her closest friends. After her ex-boyfriend Tyler had walked out 4 months ago, claiming he wasn't ready for fatherhood, she'd become protective of her privacy. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I wanted to be surprised." The plane began taxiing, and Grace gripped the armrests. Flying had always made her nervous, and pregnancy hormones only amplified her anxiety. "Not a fan of takeoffs?" Jackson asked, noticing her white knuckles. "Not particularly," she said, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine once we're in the air." The plane accelerated, pressing them back into their seats. Grace closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing. Unexpectedly, she felt a warm hand cover hers on the armrest. "My mother was terrified of flying," Jackson said conversationally, as if he wasn't currently holding her hand. "She always said counting backward from 100 helped." Grace opened one eye to look at him. "Did it? No idea. I just let her crush my hand for 20 years. His smile was warm, genuine. Nothing like the calculating businessman she'd encountered in conference rooms. The plane leveled off, and Grace realized she was still clutching Jackson's hand. She pulled away, embarrassed. "Sorry about that." "No apology necessary." He reached for his briefcase. "Since we have 3 hours, perhaps we could discuss the changes to the Riverside plans? Save some time tomorrow." Grace nodded, grateful for the shift to professional territory. "The revised structural supports you requested would require significant modifications to the atrium design." For the next hour, they pored over blueprints on Jackson's tablet, heads bent close together. Grace was impressed by his technical knowledge. Most developers she'd worked with left the architectural details to their teams. "Your solution for the cantilever issue is elegant," he commented, zooming in on her design. "I didn't think we could maintain that sightline without additional columns." "That's why you hire architects," Grace said with a smile. She shifted in her seat, trying to find a comfortable position as her lower back began to ache. "Are you all right?" Jackson asked, concern evident in his voice. "Just pregnancy discomfort, the joys of carrying around an extra person." The flight attendant arrived with their meals. Grace's stomach growled at the sight of the roasted chicken and vegetables. She hadn't had time for lunch before rushing to the airport. As they ate, their conversation drifted from work to more personal topics. Jackson told her about growing up in Seattle with his sisters, while Grace shared stories about her childhood in rural Pennsylvania. She found herself laughing at his dry humor, surprised by how easily they conversed outside the confines of business meetings. "My mom nearly fainted when I told her I was pregnant and single," Grace admitted after Jackson shared a story about his mother's reaction to his first tattoo. "She's traditional that way, but she's come around. Now she calls every day with baby name suggestions." "And the father?" Jackson asked, then immediately backtracked. "I apologize, that's not my business." "It's okay," Grace said, though the wound was still fresh. He decided fatherhood wasn't in his 5-year plan. "We'd only been dating 8 months when I got pregnant. It wasn't planned." Jackson's expression darkened. "That's unforgivable." "It's for the best," Grace said firmly. "I'd rather raise my child alone than with someone who doesn't want to be there." Their conversation was interrupted as the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The aircraft dropped suddenly and Grace gasped, instinctively grabbing Jackson's arm. "It's just a little rough air," he said calmly. "Perfectly normal." The turbulence intensified and the captain's voice came over the intercom, instructing everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Grace's heart pounded as the plane shuddered and dipped again. "Here," Jackson said, lifting the armrest between them. "Come closer." Grace hesitated only briefly before sliding toward him. Jackson put his arm around her shoulders, steady and reassuring. Despite her anxiety, she noticed how naturally she fit against him, how solid and warm he felt. "Tell me about your favorite building," he said, clearly trying to distract her. "Anywhere in the world." Grace closed her eyes, focusing on his question rather than the bouncing plane. "Falling water, Frank Lloyd Wright. The way it integrates with the landscape, balanced over the waterfall, it's perfect." "I've been there," Jackson said. "It's as impressive as you'd expect. The cantilevers are revolutionary for their time." "You know architecture," Grace murmured, impressed despite herself. "I studied engineering before business. Buildings fascinate me, how they stand, how they fall." The plane steadied, but Grace didn't move away. Jackson's shoulder was too comfortable, his voice too soothing as he described a recent trip to Barcelona to see Gaudí's work. The tension of the day, the rushed packing, the stress of the airport, the turbulence, began to fade. Her eyelids grew heavy. "Sorry," she mumbled, fighting to stay awake. "Pregnancy fatigue is real." "Rest," Jackson said softly. "We still have an hour before landing." Grace meant to sit up, to maintain some professional boundary with a man who was essentially her boss's boss. Instead, lulled by the hum of the engines and the steady rise and fall of Jackson's chest, she drifted into sleep. She dreamed of a house by a waterfall, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. A child's laughter echoed through bright, open rooms, and a deep voice called her name, filled with warmth that felt like home. When Grace stirred, the plane was descending. Disoriented, she realized her head was nestled against Jackson's shoulder, her hand resting on his chest. Mortified, she started to pull away. "Easy," Jackson murmured, his arms still around her. His free hand reached across to rest gently on her belly. A look of wonder crossed his face. "Was that—" "The baby's kicking," Grace whispered, surprised. She'd felt flutters before, but this was the first real, definitive kick. Without thinking, she placed her hand over his, pressing slightly to guide him to the right spot. The baby kicked again, stronger this time. Jackson's expression transformed, a smile spreading across his face unlike anything she'd seen from him before. "That's amazing," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. Then, to her complete shock, he leaned down and spoke directly to her bump. "Hello in there. You've got quite a kick." Grace's heart fluttered at the tenderness in his voice. This was a side of Jackson Reed she never could have imagined, gentle, almost vulnerable. The plane bumped slightly as the landing gear deployed, breaking the moment. Jackson looked up, still smiling, his hand lingering on her belly. "Our little traveler seems ready for Chicago," he said. Grace froze. "Our?" Had she heard him correctly? Before she could process what he'd said, the plane touched down with a jolt, and the cabin erupted in the usual cacophony of seatbelts unclicking and overhead bins opening. Jackson's phone buzzed, and he reluctantly removed his hand from her belly to check the message. His expression shifted back to the businesslike mask she recognized. My driver will be waiting, he said, gathering his things. Would you allow me to give you a ride to your hotel? Still stunned by what she thought she'd heard, and the intimacy they'd just shared, Grace nodded wordlessly. As they walked through the terminal side by side, Grace couldn't help wondering if she'd imagined that one small word, R and Y, despite all logic. It had sent a spark of something hopeful through her heart. The sleek black Escalade glided through Chicago's evening traffic, its tinted windows shielding Grace from the flashing neon of downtown. She sat rigidly on the butter-soft leather seat, acutely aware of Jackson beside her, his attention divided between his phone and occasional glances in her direction. The Palmer House, please, Marcus, Jackson instructed the driver before turning to Grace. I've taken the liberty of upgrading your accommodations. The standard rooms at the Palmer are charming but small. That's not necessary, Grace protested. The company already... I insist, Jackson said, his tone brooking no argument. You need proper rest before tomorrow's meeting. The junior suite has a separate sitting area where you can review the blueprints comfortably. Grace wanted to object further, but found herself nodding instead. The thought of a spacious suite rather than the cramped room her modest architectural firm had booked was admittedly appealing. 5 months pregnant and facing a day of contentious negotiations, she could use the extra comfort. Thank you, she said finally. That's very considerate. Jackson's phone buzzed again. He frowned at the screen before answering. Read here. His voice shifted into the clipped authoritative tone she recognized from their previous meetings. No, that's unacceptable. I was explicitly clear about the timeline. While he spoke, Grace gazed out at the Chicago skyline, her mind replaying the moment on the plane when Jackson's hand had rested on her belly, when he'd said, "Our little traveler." Had she misheard? Or worse, had it been a slip of the tongue he now regretted? Jackson ended his call with a sharp exhale. I apologize for the interruption. Business doesn't stop for plane rides, Grace said with a small smile. Unfortunately not. He tucked his phone away. Are you hungry? We could stop for dinner before the hotel. The question caught her off guard. Was he suggesting they dine together? Before she could answer, her stomach growled audibly, making the decision for her. Jackson chuckled, the sound rich and unexpectedly warm. I'll take that as a yes. Marcus Gibson's, please. Oh no, I didn't mean, Grace stammered. Gibson's was one of Chicago's premier steakhouses, far beyond her usual budget. Consider it a working dinner, Jackson said smoothly. We can continue our discussion about the atrium modifications. 30 minutes later, they were seated at a secluded corner table at Gibson's, the restaurant's dark wood and soft lighting creating an intimate atmosphere that felt distinctly unbusinesslike. Grace studied the menu with mounting horror at the prices. The filet is excellent, Jackson suggested, not bothering to look at his own menu. I'm sure it is, Grace murmured. She closed the menu decisively. I think I'll have the Caesar salad. Jackson frowned. You need more than a salad. You're eating for two. That's actually a myth, Grace countered. In the second trimester, you only need about 340 extra calories daily. A Caesar salad is plenty. Jackson's eyebrows rose. You've done your research. Wouldn't you? This is my first time growing a human being. Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly. Something softened in Jackson's expression. When the waiter appeared, he ordered a filet for himself and looked expectantly at Grace. The grilled salmon, please, she relented, and sparkling water. After the waiter departed, an awkward silence fell between them. Here, away from the intimate confines of the airplane, Grace was suddenly conscious of the vast differences in their positions. Jackson Reed was worth billions, while she was a talented but modestly compensated architect from a small firm, preparing to raise a child on a single income. Tell me about your firm, Jackson said, breaking the silence. Meadows and Associates isn't large, but your designs caught my attention immediately. Grace relaxed slightly, on familiar ground. David Meadows took a chance on me straight out of graduate school. We're small but selective about our projects. The Riverside Tower is our largest commission to date. Why architecture? Jackson asked, leaning forward slightly. The question was simple, but profound. Grace considered it carefully. I've always been fascinated by the way spaces affect people. A well-designed building isn't just structurally sound, it shapes how people feel, how they interact, what they remember. Jackson nodded slowly. That's exactly what drew me to your proposal. Most of the submissions were technically proficient but soulless. Yours told a story. Warmth bloomed in Grace's chest at the unexpected praise. Before she could respond, their food arrived, steaming and aromatic. "So," Jackson said after they'd begun eating, "have you started preparing the nursery yet?" The personal question startled her. "Not really. My apartment is tiny, and I'm considering moving before the baby comes. Something with a second bedroom, ideally. In Boston's housing market, that won't be easy on an architect's salary." The blunt assessment stung, though Grace knew he was right. "I've been saving, and my parents offered to help with the down payment." Jackson nodded, but she caught something like disapproval in his expression. Before she could ask about it, he changed the subject. "Tomorrow's meeting may get contentious," he warned. "The investors are nervous about the increased materials costs. Some are pushing to scale back the design elements that make the project special." Grace straightened, professional pride flaring. "Those design elements are what will make Riverside Tower a landmark rather than just another glass box. If they want something forgettable, they should hire someone else." To her surprise, Jackson smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." "You're testing me," Grace realized, narrowing her eyes. "I needed to know you'd fight for your vision. I'm on your side, Grace. I want this building to be extraordinary." The use of her first name sent an unexpected thrill through her. In their previous interactions, he'd always addressed her formally as Ms. Mitchell. "In that case, Jackson," she said, emphasizing his name, "I'll need you to back me up when your investors start complaining about the cantilevered observation deck. You have my word." Their conversation flowed more easily after that, shifting between professional discussions about the project and more personal exchanges. Grace found herself laughing at Jackson's dry observations about the architectural disasters of certain Chicago buildings. He was knowledgeable and passionate, far from the cold businessman she'd initially judged him to be. By the time they finished their meals, Grace felt a confusing mix of professional respect and personal attraction that she knew was dangerous. Jackson Reed was brilliant, attentive, and undeniably magnetic, but he was also her client, and she was 5 months pregnant with another man's child. Whatever had happened on the plane was surely a momentary aberration. "Shall we head to the hotel?" Jackson asked after settling the bill, waving away Grace's attempt to contribute. The Palmer House lobby was a gilded spectacle of old-world luxury. Grace tried not to gawk as Jackson efficiently handled her check-in, somehow securing an upgrade beyond the junior suite he'd already arranged. "The Harrison Suite," the concierge announced with reverence, handing Grace a key card. "Our finest accommodation. Mr. Reed, your usual suite is ready as well." "You didn't have to do that," Grace whispered as they walked toward the elevators. "The Harrison has the best view of the city," Jackson said simply, "and the most comfortable sofa for reviewing blueprints." In the elevator, standing closer than strictly necessary, Grace became hyper-aware of his presence, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his shoulder brushed against hers when the elevator stopped. The pregnancy hormones she'd blamed for so many things lately couldn't explain away the flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with the baby. "This is me," Grace said needlessly when they reached her floor. She stepped out, then turned back. "Thank you for dinner. And the room upgrade." "My pleasure." Jackson held the elevator door. "What time would you like to meet in the morning?" "The investors won't arrive until 10. 8:30? We could review our strategy." "Perfect. I'll have breakfast sent up." His eyes held hers for a beat too long. "Rest well, Grace." The Harrison suite was larger than Grace's entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. A massive 4-poster bed dominated one room, while a separate living area featured elegant furnishings arranged around a marble fireplace. She wandered through the space in disbelief, running her fingers over luxurious fabrics and gleaming surfaces. Her suitcase had already been delivered and unpacked, her modest clothing looking out of place hanging in the palatial closet. On the coffee table, she found a basket of pregnancy-safe snacks, herbal teas, and a lavender-scented eye pillow with a note. "For better rest, J.R." The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught her off guard. How had he arranged this so quickly? And why was he being so attentive? Grace's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend, Nicole. "Landed safely. Hotel okay?" She typed back, "Safe but strange. Tell you later." Too restless to sleep despite her fatigue, Grace spread the Riverside Tower blueprints across the suite's dining table. She became so absorbed in reviewing the contested design elements that she didn't notice the time until her phone chimed with another message. This one was from Jackson. "Too late to call?" Grace hesitated, then replied, "Still awake, working." Seconds later, her phone rang. "You should be resting," Jackson said without preamble when she answered. "Says the man who's also clearly still working at midnight," Grace countered, smiling despite herself. "Touché." She could hear the smile in his voice. "I wanted to check if the suite is satisfactory." "It's ridiculous and perfect, thank you." "Have you tried the bathtub? It has jets that would be excellent for pregnancy backaches." Grace glanced toward the bathroom door. "Are you saying I should stop working and take a bath?" "Doctor's orders." "You're not a doctor." "No, but I dated one for 3 years. I picked up a few things." The casual mention of a past relationship shouldn't have bothered her, but Grace felt an irrational pang of jealousy. "I'll consider it," she said lightly. "The investors are bringing their lawyers tomorrow," Jackson said, shifting to business. "Be prepared for them to challenge every element of the design that adds cost." "I'll be ready." "I know you will." His confidence in her was both flattering and intimidating. "I should let you rest. Good night, Grace." "Good night, Jackson." After hanging up, Grace did take that bath, sinking into steaming, jasmine-scented water that eased the ache in her lower back. As she relaxed, her mind drifted back to the moment on the plane. Jackson's hand warm on her belly, his voice soft as he'd said, "Our little traveler." The memory sent a confusing mix of emotions through her. Grace had made peace with raising her child alone after Tyler's abandonment. She'd rebuilt her plans, adjusted her expectations, embraced the challenge of single motherhood. She wasn't looking for a replacement father for her baby. But as she drifted towards sleep that night, nestled in the luxury of sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent, Grace couldn't help wondering what it might be like to have someone like Jackson Reed in her corner, someone strong and steady, someone who looked at her with that unexpected warmth in his eyes. In her dreams, she was again on the plane, her head resting on his shoulder. But this time, when Jackson placed his hand on her belly and whispered to her unborn child, Grace clearly heard every word. "Don't worry, little one. I'll take care of both of you." Grace woke to sunlight streaming through the suite's floor-to-ceiling windows and the muted sounds of Chicago traffic 20 floors below. For a moment, she lay disoriented in the massive bed, the previous day's events flooding back. The plane ride, Jackson's hand on her belly, the dinner that felt less like a business meeting and more like, "Stop it," she muttered to herself, pushing away the covers. She couldn't afford to romanticize the situation. Jackson Reed was being kind, perhaps unusually so, but he was still her client. Nothing more. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Wrapping herself in the plush hotel robe, Grace padded across the suite. Through the peephole, she saw a room service attendant with a covered cart. "Breakfast delivery for Ms. Mitchell," the young woman announced cheerfully after Grace opened the door. "Compliments of Mr. Reed." "Thank you," Grace said, stepping aside as the attendant wheeled in a cart laden with covered silver dishes, a carafe of what smelled like freshly brewed coffee, and a smaller pot that turned out to be herbal tea. "Mr. Reed requested specific items," the attendant explained, lifting the covers to reveal a spread that included steel-cut oatmeal with fresh berries, whole grain toast, scrambled eggs, and a small dish of Greek yogurt. He mentioned these were pregnancy-friendly breakfast options. Grace felt a flush of pleasure at the thoughtfulness, followed immediately by confusion. How would Jackson know what constituted a pregnancy-friendly breakfast? After the attendant departed, Grace's phone chimed with a text. "Breakfast delivered. Meeting pushed to 9:30. Take your time. Received. Thank you." "Very thoughtful selections," she replied, then hesitated before adding, "How did you know what pregnant women should eat for breakfast?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, "Research. I'll see you at 9:30 in my suite, 2201. Grace showered and dressed with particular care, selecting her most professional maternity outfit, a navy dress with a blazer that mostly disguised her growing bump. At precisely 9:25, she knocked on the door of suite 2201, blueprints and tablet tucked under her arm. Jackson opened the door immediately, as if he'd been waiting. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing muscular forearms dusted with dark hair. No tie, no jacket, a more casual version of the intimidating CEO she was accustomed to. "Good morning," he said, stepping back to let her enter. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Grace admitted. "That mattress is magical." Jackson's suite was even larger than hers, configured as a working space with a conference table already covered in documents. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, sparkling blue under the morning sun. "Coffee," he offered, gesturing to a carafe similar to the one that had arrived with her breakfast. "I've already had my one permitted cup for the day," Grace declined with a rueful smile. "Caffeine restrictions are the worst part of pregnancy." "Worse than morning sickness?" Jackson asked, raising an eyebrow as he poured himself a cup. "I got lucky there. Just a few weeks of queasiness." She set her materials on the table. "Shall we get started?" For the next 45 minutes they strategized, anticipating the investors' objections and preparing counter-arguments. Grace was impressed by Jackson's grasp of the technical details and his clear passion for the project. "Why is this building so important to you?" she asked during a brief lull. "It's not even your largest development." Jackson was quiet for a moment, staring out at the lake. "My father started Reed Enterprises with a single apartment building in Seattle. Before he died, he talked about creating something truly remarkable, a structure that would outlive us all." He turned back to her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Riverside is that building." The personal revelation touched Grace. "That's why you chose our design. Your vision aligned perfectly with what I imagined." His eyes held hers. "You understand that buildings aren't just investments, they're legacies." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Grace couldn't or wouldn't name. Jackson took a step toward her, then stopped as his phone buzzed loudly. "The investors are in the lobby," he said, after checking the message. His demeanor shifted, professional mask sliding back into place. "Ready?" Grace nodded, gathering her materials. "Ready?" They took the elevator down to a conference room on the mezzanine level where 5 men in expensive suits waited. Grace recognized Harold Winters, the most vocal of the investor group from previous meetings. His thin smile didn't reach his eyes as they entered. "Jackson, Ms. Mitchell," Winters greeted them coolly. "I hope you've both reconsidered your positions on the budget concerns we raised last month." "Good morning, Harold," Jackson replied evenly. "We've prepared some alternatives that maintain the integrity of the design while addressing cost considerations." Grace took her cue, distributing folders containing the modified plans. "We've identified several areas where material substitutions could reduce costs without compromising the design, aesthetic, or structural integrity." For the next 2 hours, the meeting progressed exactly as Jackson had predicted. The investors questioned every design choice, from the curved glass facade to the open-air terraces on the upper floors. Grace defended her vision passionately but professionally, backed at every turn by Jackson's firm support. "The observation deck cantilever is non-negotiable," Jackson stated, when Winters suggested eliminating it entirely. "It's the signature element of the building." "It adds $7 million to the budget," Winters countered, his voice sharp. "It adds $20 million to the property value and makes Riverside an iconic addition to the skyline," Jackson replied. "The cantilever stays." Grace felt a surge of gratitude for his unwavering support. Most developers would have folded under the pressure to cut costs, but Jackson was fighting for her vision as fiercely as she was. By noon, they'd reached compromises on several secondary issues while preserving all the critical design elements. Grace's head throbbed from the tension, and her back ached from sitting too long in the uncomfortable conference chairs. "I think we've made excellent progress," Jackson announced, effectively ending the meeting. "Grace and I will incorporate these modifications and circulate updated plans next week." As the investors filed out, Winters lingered. "Reed." "A word," he requested, glancing pointedly at Grace. "Anything you need to say can be said in front of Ms. Mitchell," Jackson replied firmly. Winters' mouth thinned. "Fine. Some of us are concerned about your personal involvement in this project. Your judgment seems compromised." Jackson's expression hardened. "My judgment is perfectly clear, Harold. I recognize exceptional design when I see it." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Winters' gaze flickered to Grace's belly, then back to Jackson. "Rumors are circulating." Grace's breath caught. "What rumors?" "I don't respond to innuendo," Jackson said coldly. "If you have concerns about the project, voice them directly. Otherwise, this conversation is over." Winters shrugged and departed, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. "What was that about?" Grace asked, her heart pounding. Jackson ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "Office politics. Nothing you need to worry about." It seemed like he was implying, "Ignore him," Jackson interrupted. "Harold's upset because I rejected his nephew's firm for this project in favor of Meadows and Associates." The explanation made sense, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening beneath the surface. Before she could press further, Jackson checked his watch. "We have a site visit scheduled for 2 o'clock. Are you up for it? We can reschedule if you're tired." "I'm fine," Grace assured him, though in truth her feet were swollen and her back was killing her. "I'd like to see the progress." "Let's grab lunch first," Jackson suggested. "There's a quiet place nearby." The quiet place turned out to be an exclusive restaurant on the top floor of a neighboring building with a reservation that Jackson had clearly arranged in advance. As they were led to a window table with stunning views, Grace wondered again at his attentiveness. "You don't need to keep treating me to fancy meals," she said after they'd ordered. "Is it so hard to believe I enjoy your company?" Jackson countered, his gaze direct. Grace felt her cheeks warm. "We barely knew each other before yesterday." "Sometimes connections form quickly," he leaned forward slightly. "I feel like I've known you longer than I have." The intensity in his eyes made Grace's heart flutter. This was dangerous territory. "Jackson, tell me about your plans," he interrupted. "After the baby comes, will you take leave from work?" Grateful for the shift to safer ground, Grace nodded. 3 months. David's been very supportive. "And childcare when you return?" "I'm on waiting lists for several daycare centers," Grace sighed. "Boston childcare is almost as expensive as rent. I might need to find a work-from-home arrangement part-time." Jackson frowned. "That seems unnecessarily complicated." "Welcome to single motherhood," Grace said with a wry smile. "It's all complicated." "It doesn't have to be," he replied, his voice dropping lower. Before she could ask what he meant, their food arrived. The conversation shifted to the site visit ahead, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had almost been said. After lunch, Jackson's driver took them to the Riverside construction site. Grace changed from her heels to the practical boots she'd packed, grateful she'd had the foresight to prepare for this part of the trip. The site was a hive of activity, cranes swinging overhead, workers calling to each other, the skeletal lower floors of what would eventually be a 60-story tower already taking shape. A project manager greeted them with hard hats and a tablet of progress photos. "The foundation work is ahead of schedule," he reported. "We've had good weather." For the next hour, they toured the site, with Grace pointing out where key design elements would eventually be implemented. Standing amid the concrete and steel, she could already envision the completed building, the soaring atrium, the hanging gardens on the stepped terraces, the dramatic cantilever that would extend over the river. "It's going to be magnificent," she said, unable to contain her excitement. Jackson watched her with a soft expression she couldn't quite interpret. "Yes, it is." As they made their way back toward the site entrance, Grace stepped carefully around a puddle, but her boot slipped on the muddy ground. She lurched forward with a startled cry. Jackson reacted instantly, catching her before she could fall, his arms wrapped securely around her, one hand protectively cradling her belly. For a breathless moment, they stood frozen, his body solid against hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough near her ear. Grace nodded, too shaken to speak. She was acutely aware of his hand still resting on her stomach, the warmth of it seeping through her coat. "The baby?" he pressed, genuine concern in his voice. "Fine," she managed. "We're both fine." Reluctantly, it seemed, Jackson released her, though he kept one hand at her elbow as they navigated the remaining distance to the car. The site manager gave them an odd look that Grace couldn't interpret. In the privacy of the car, Jackson turned to her. "Perhaps we should cut the day short. You've been on your feet for hours." "I'm not made of glass," Grace protested. "Pregnant women work construction jobs every day." "Not on my sites, they don't," Jackson retorted. Then, seeing her expression, he softened his tone. "I'm not questioning your capability, Grace. I'm concerned about your comfort." The genuine worry in his eyes melted her resistance. "I am tired," she admitted, "but I had one more stop planned. The architectural salvage warehouse has some period fixtures that would be perfect for the executive floor's reception area." "Tomorrow," Jackson said firmly. "Right now, you're going back to the hotel to rest." Too exhausted to argue, Grace acquiesced. During the ride back, she found herself drifting towards sleep again, her head eventually coming to rest against Jackson's shoulder, just as it had on the plane. This time, she was vaguely aware of his arms slipping around her, drawing her closer. When they reached the hotel, Jackson insisted on escorting her to her suite. At her door, Grace turned to thank him. "I appreciate your support today," she said. "With the investors, I mean." "You don't need to thank me for backing the right design," Jackson replied. He hesitated, then added, "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" "Not a business dinner. Just dinner." The invitation hung between them, its implications clear. Grace's pulse quickened. "Jackson, I'm 5 months pregnant with another man's child," she said softly. "Whatever this is between us, I know exactly what you are, Grace," he interrupted, his voice low and intense. "I've known from the moment you walked into my office 3 months ago with those brilliant designs and fire in your eyes." He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "I don't care about the baby's biological father. He gave up any right to matter when he walked away from you both." Grace's breath caught. "You can't mean that." "I've never meant anything more," Jackson said, holding her gaze. "Have dinner with me, please." The sincerity in his eyes was her undoing. "Yes," she whispered. Jackson smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face from handsome to breathtaking. "I'll pick you up at 7. After he left, Grace leaned against the closed door, her heart racing. What was she doing? This was professional suicide, emotional recklessness. She barely knew Jackson Reed beyond business meetings and 2 days of unexpected intimacy, yet she couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them with startling speed. The way he looked at her, not with pity for her situation or discomfort at her pregnancy, but with admiration and something deeper, more primal. Grace's phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Nicole. "Spill it," her friend demanded without preamble. "Your cryptic text has me worried. How's Chicago?" Grace sank onto the plush sofa. "Nick, I think I'm in trouble." "What kind of trouble? Baby trouble? Work trouble? Jackson Reed trouble? Your billionaire client? What happened?" Grace recounted the events of the past 2 days, the plane ride, the dinner, the meeting, the almost fall at the construction site. Nicole listened without interrupting, a feat Grace knew was difficult for her outspoken friend. "And now I've agreed to have dinner with him tonight," Grace concluded. "Not a business dinner. His words." Nicole was silent for a moment. "Wow. I know, it's crazy." "Is it, though?" Nicole asked thoughtfully. "Look, I know it seems fast, but some connections are just like that. And it's not like you're a starry-eyed teenager. You're a successful professional who happens to be having a baby." "A baby that isn't his," Grace pointed out. "Has he seemed bothered by that at all?" Grace thought about Jackson's hand on her belly, the way he'd spoken to her unborn child. "No. The opposite, actually. It's like he's—" She trailed off, uncertain how to articulate it. "Protective? Interested? Involved?" Nicole supplied. "All of those," Grace admitted. "It's confusing, only if you overthink it. Do you like him?" The question was simple, but profound. Did she like Jackson Reed, the brilliant, demanding CEO who fought for her designs, the attentive man who researched pregnancy-friendly breakfasts and upgraded her hotel room, the complex person who'd shared his father's dream and caught her when she stumbled? "Yes," Grace said quietly. "I do." "Then go to dinner," Nicole advised. "See where it leads. Just be careful with your heart, okay? You've been through enough this year." After hanging up, Grace rested her hands on her rounded belly, feeling a flutter of movement within. "What do you think, little one?" she murmured. "Should we take a chance?" The baby kicked in response, a decisive thump that made Grace smile despite her confusion. For better or worse, she had a dinner date with Jackson Reed, and for the first time since learning of her pregnancy, she felt something she'd thought was lost to her, possibility. At precisely 7 o'clock, Grace smoothed her hands over the midnight blue dress she'd packed for the client dinner that was supposed to have happened tonight. The stretchy material accommodated her bump while still managing to look elegant, and the neckline was low enough to be flattering without being inappropriate. She'd spent an embarrassing amount of time on her appearance, curling her hair into soft waves, applying makeup with more care than usual, even using the scented lotion from the hotel's luxurious bathroom. A knock at the door sent her heart racing. Taking a deep breath, she opened it to find Jackson standing there, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal suit with no tie, his collar open at the throat. "You look beautiful," he said, his appreciative gaze making her cheeks warm. "Thank you," Grace replied, suddenly shy. "You clean up pretty well yourself." Jackson smiled, offering his arm. "Shall we?" Instead of heading to the elevator, he led her down the corridor to another door, a private entrance to the hotel's rooftop garden. "I thought you might prefer something more intimate than a restaurant," he explained as they stepped outside. The rooftop had been transformed into a private dining paradise. Strings of lights twinkled overhead, creating a canopy of stars against the darkening sky. A single table was set in a secluded corner overlooking the Chicago skyline, with a heater nearby to ward off the evening chill. A violinist played softly near the railing, the music floating on the gentle breeze. "Jackson," Grace breathed, overwhelmed. "This is extraordinary." "Too much?" he asked, a rare hint of uncertainty in his voice. "It's perfect," she assured him, genuinely touched by the effort he'd made. As they settled at the table, a waiter appeared with sparkling water and a selection of appetizers. Grace noticed that everything, from the cushioned chair to the footstool discreetly positioned beside it, had been arranged with her comfort in mind. "You've thought of everything," she remarked. "I try to be thorough," Jackson replied with a small smile. "It's a professional hazard." As they began to eat, Grace found herself relaxing, the awkwardness she'd feared giving way to easy conversation. They talked about architecture, their favorite cities, books they'd read recently, discovering shared interests and complementary perspectives that made the time fly by. "Tell me about your family," Jackson said as their main courses arrived. "You mentioned your parents offered to help with the down payment." "They're high school teachers in Pennsylvania," Grace explained. "Solid, practical people who've been married for 35 years. They were shocked about the baby, but rallied quickly. My dad's already planning to teach his grandchild to fish." "And siblings?" "An older brother in Colorado, environmental scientist. He sends the baby educational toys that won't be age-appropriate for years." Grace smiled fondly. "What about your family? You mentioned 2 sisters, Megan and Claire." Jackson nodded, both younger. "Megan's the one who just had her second child. She's a pediatrician in Seattle. Claire runs our family's charitable foundation. And your mother?" Something flickered across Jackson's face. "She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly, instinctively reaching across the table to touch his hand. Jackson turned his palm up, capturing her fingers in his. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "She always appreciated people with conviction." The simple statement moved Grace unexpectedly. "Tell me about her?" For the next half hour, Jackson shared stories about his mother, a formidable woman who'd balanced raising 3 children with running the financial side of Reed Enterprises alongside her husband. Grace listened, enchanted by this glimpse into his past, the forces that had shaped him. "After my father died, she kept the company going until I finished business school," Jackson explained. "She could have sold it, but she knew how much it meant to him, to all of us." "She sounds remarkable," Grace said. "She was." Jackson's thumb traced patterns on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. "When she got sick, I promised her I'd continue building the legacy, but also that I'd remember what she always said was most important, which was family." His eyes held hers. "She worried I was too focused on work, that I'd miss what truly mattered." The word hung between them, laden with meaning Grace wasn't sure she was ready to interpret. She gently withdrew her hand, needing space to think clearly. "This connection between us," she began carefully. "It's happened so quickly. I'm concerned that you might be romanticizing the situation." Jackson's expression grew serious. "You think I'm attracted to the idea of rescuing a pregnant woman? Some kind of white knight fantasy?" Put so bluntly, it sounded ridiculous, but Grace nodded. "The thought crossed my mind." "Then let me be clear," Jackson said, leaning forward. "I've been intrigued by you since our first meeting 3 months ago. Your pregnancy doesn't define you to me, Grace. It's simply part of who you are, a part I respect and honor, but not the reason for my interest." His directness was disarming. "Then what is the reason? Your brilliance, your integrity, the way you fight for your vision without compromising." His gaze was unwavering. "The fact that you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen doesn't hurt either." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Jackson, I know the timing is complicated," he continued. "I know there are professional considerations, but I also know that some opportunities don't come around twice." Before Grace could respond, the baby kicked sharply, making her gasp and press a hand to her side. "Are you all right?" Jackson asked, immediately concerned. "Fine," she assured him. "Someone's just very active tonight." Without thinking, she took his hand and placed it where the baby was kicking. Jackson's expression transformed with wonder as he felt the movement beneath his palm. "That's incredible," he murmured. "It still amazes me every time," Grace admitted. Jackson didn't remove his hand. Instead, he looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I want to be part of this, Grace, part of your life, part of the baby's life, if you'll let me." The declaration stunned her. "You can't possibly know that yet." "I do know," he insisted. "I've never been more certain of anything." Grace shook her head, overwhelmed. "This is too fast. We barely know each other." "Then let's change that," Jackson said. "Come to Seattle next weekend, meet my sisters, my nephew, let me show you my world." "I can't just fly across the country on a whim," Grace protested. "I have work, doctor's appointments, all of which can be rescheduled," Jackson countered. "Just think about it, please." Before she could answer, his phone buzzed. Jackson glanced at it and frowned. "I need to take this. Excuse me for a moment." As he stepped away to take the call, Grace tried to collect her thoughts. Everything was moving so quickly, spinning beyond her control. Jackson was offering her something she'd never expected to find again after Tyler walked out. A partner, a future, security for her child. It was tempting, alluring, and terrifying. What if this was just an infatuation that would fade as quickly as it had formed? What if Jackson realized he wasn't ready for an instant family after all? Grace couldn't bear the thought of another abandonment, another person walking away from her child. Jackson returned, his expression troubled. "I apologize for the interruption." "Is everything all right?" Grace asked, noticing the tension in his shoulders. He hesitated, then sighed. "Not entirely. That was Harold Winters." Grace's stomach tightened. "What did he want?" "To warn me," Jackson said grimly. "Apparently there's a story circulating among the investors. About us." "What kind of story?" Grace asked, though she could guess. "That I awarded the Riverside contract to your firm because we were involved. That our relationship compromised my business judgment." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Harold suggested that if the rumor reaches the board, they might force a review of the project." Grace felt sick. "But that's not true. We weren't involved when you selected Meadows and Associates." "Of course it's not true, but perception matters in business." Jackson ran a hand through his hair. "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." She nodded, her throat dry. "If this becomes public, this connection between us, would it damage your professional reputation? Would David Meadows have reason to question your integrity?" The question hit home. Grace had been so caught up in her feelings that she hadn't fully considered the professional implications. "It wouldn't look good," she admitted. "People might assume I earned the commission through personal means." Jackson's expression darkened. "That's unacceptable. Your talent and hard work deserve recognition, not speculation." "What are you saying?" He was quiet for a long moment, conflict evident in his eyes. "Maybe we should take a step back until after the Riverside project is completed." Though she'd been having similar thoughts, hearing him say the words aloud stung more than Grace expected. "I see. I don't want to," Jackson clarified quickly, "but I won't let my feelings for you undermine your professional standing. You've worked too hard." "My professional standing," Grace repeated. "That's your only concern?" "No," Jackson admitted. "I'm also concerned about Harold's motivations. He's wanted me out as CEO for years. This could give him leverage with the board." The reminder of their vastly different worlds hit Grace like a bucket of cold water. Jackson Reed wasn't just a man. He was the head of a billion-dollar empire with shareholders, board members, and corporate politics she could barely imagine. "Maybe this was a mistake," she said quietly, pushing back from the table. "We got caught up in whatever this is, but reality was always going to intrude." "Grace?" Jackson started to reach for her hand, then stopped himself. "Don't do this. We can find a solution." "I think the solution is obvious," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We maintain a professional relationship until Riverside is completed. Then we go our separate ways." "That's not what I want," Jackson said, his voice low and intense. "What you want isn't always what makes sense," Grace replied, standing. The baby kicked again, as if in agreement. "Thank you for dinner, Jackson. It was lovely. But I think I should go." Before he could respond, she turned and walked quickly toward the door, tears threatening. She heard him call her name but couldn't look back without breaking down completely. Back in her suite, Grace paced the luxurious rooms that now felt like a gilded cage. She'd been a fool to think this could work, that she, a pregnant architect from a small firm, could have a place in Jackson Reed's world of corporate dynasties and billion-dollar decisions. Her phone rang, Jackson, of course. She let it go to voicemail, then it rang again. And again. Finally, Grace picked up. "Please don't call anymore," she said before he could speak. "This is for the best." "Is that what you truly believe?" Jackson asked, his voice rough with emotion. "That walking away is the best solution?" "Yes," Grace lied. "I need to focus on my baby and my career. I can't be distracted by complications." "Is that what I am to you? A complication?" The hurt in his voice made her chest ache. "Jackson, please, this isn't easy for me either." "Then don't do it," he said simply. "Open your door." Grace froze. "What?" "I'm in the hallway," Jackson admitted. "I couldn't let you leave like that, not without saying what I need to say." Despite her better judgment, Grace moved to the door and pulled it open. Jackson stood there, his tie loosened, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Grace stepped back wordlessly, allowing him to enter. Jackson closed the door behind him but didn't move further into the room, maintaining a careful distance between them. "I've never been good at this," he began. "Expressing feelings. My sisters would confirm that." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "But I need to try, because what's happening between us matters too much for miscommunication." Grace crossed her arms protectively over her bump. "I'm listening." "When I suggested we take a step back, it wasn't because I'm having second thoughts or because I'm concerned about corporate politics. It was because I respect your career too much to let my feelings for you undermine it." Jackson's gaze was steady, sincere. "I want to protect what you've built." "I don't need protection," Grace said softly. "I need honesty." "Then honestly?" "I'm falling in love with you, Grace Mitchell." The words hung in the air between them. "I know it's fast, I know it's complicated, but it's the truth." Grace's heart thundered in her chest. "Jackson, I'm not asking you to say it back," he continued. "I'm not asking for any promises. I'm just asking you not to walk away because of other people's perceptions or corporate games or some misguided belief that this can't work." "And what about the baby?" Grace asked, her hand resting on her belly. "My child will always be a part of my life, a priority, as they should be," Jackson said simply. "I would never ask otherwise." "You say that now, but Grace." Jackson finally moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "I lost my father when I was 22, my mother 3 years ago. Family isn't something I take lightly. If you let me into your life, into your child's life, I promise you I won't walk away." The sincerity in his eyes made her throat tight with emotion. "I'm scared," she admitted in a whisper. "So am I," Jackson confessed, surprising her. "I've built skyscrapers and negotiated billion-dollar deals, but nothing has terrified me more than the thought of losing you before we've even had a chance to begin." His vulnerability broke something open inside her. Grace reached out, placing her palm against his cheek. Jackson turned his face to press a kiss to her hand, the gesture achingly tender. "We'll figure out the professional complications," he promised, "together. We can be discreet until Riverside is completed if that's what you need. I'll recuse myself from decisions involving your firm, whatever it takes." "And if it doesn't work out?" Grace asked softly. "If this feeling fades?" "It won't," Jackson said with quiet certainty. "But if you're asking for my word that I'll never hurt you or your child, you have it. Whatever happens between us, I will always treat you both with respect and care." The baby kicked again, a strong movement that made Grace gasp softly. Without thinking, she took Jackson's hand and placed it on the spot. "Feel that? I think someone's voting." Jackson smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his face. "Smart kid," Grace laughed, the sound catching on a sob. "This is crazy." "The best things often are," Jackson murmured, his hand still resting on her belly. When he leaned forward, Grace met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, questioning, a promise rather than a demand. Jackson's hand came up to cup her face, his touch reverent as if she were something precious. When they parted, Grace rested her forehead against his. "I'm still not coming to Seattle next weekend," she said with a small smile. "That's too fast even for this whirlwind," Jackson chuckled. "Fair enough. How about dinner in Boston next Friday instead? I'll fly to you." "That's acceptable," Grace agreed, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "And perhaps I could accompany you to your next ultrasound appointment?" he suggested tentatively. "Only if you're comfortable with that." The request touched her deeply. "I'd like that," she said softly. Outside the windows of the suite, Chicago glittered like a sea of stars. Inside, in the circle of Jackson's arms, Grace felt a sense of homecoming she'd never expected to find, especially not with a billionaire CEO she'd met on a plane just 2 days ago. Life, she was learning, rarely followed the blueprints you designed for it. Sometimes the most beautiful structures arose from unexpected foundations. 6 months later, Grace stood at the bedroom window of Jackson's Seattle home, gazing out at the moonlight reflecting off Puget Sound. Behind her, a state-of-the-art nursery waited for its occupant, who was due to arrive any day now. The past months had been a whirlwind of cross-country flights, video calls, and careful navigation of their professional relationship, while Riverside Tower rose floor by floor. Jackson had been true to his word, recusing himself from decisions involving Meadows and Associates, while making it clear to Harold Winters and the board that his personal life was not up for discussion. When Grace had gone into premature labor at 7 months, Jackson had been in meetings in Tokyo. He'd chartered a private jet and made it to Boston in record time, arriving just as doctors successfully halted her contractions. He'd stayed by her side through the 2 weeks of mandated bed rest that followed, working remotely and reading architecture magazines aloud to keep her from going stir-crazy. It was during those quiet days, confined to her small Boston apartment, that Grace had fallen irrevocably in love with Jackson Reed, not the billionaire CEO, but the man who made her tea and rubbed her swollen feet and talked to her belly each night as if the baby could understand every word. When her lease ended the following month, Jackson had suggested she move to Seattle, not into his home but into a beautiful apartment he owned downtown, giving her independence while keeping her close. Grace had countered with a different proposal. She would move to Seattle, open a West Coast office for Meadows and Associates. David had been delighted by the expansion opportunity, and they would take the next steps in their relationship without artificial separation. The sound of footsteps pulled Grace from her memories. Jackson appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened after a long day at the office. "How are my 2 favorite people?" he asked, crossing to wrap his arms around her from behind, his hands cradling her now enormous belly. "Restless," Grace replied, leaning back against his chest. "Someone's been practicing gymnastics all afternoon." Jackson chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back, getting ready for the big entrance. "Speaking of entrances," Grace said, turning in his arms. "Riverside Tower made the cover of Architectural Digest. David called while you were in your meeting." Jackson's face lit up with pride. "Of course it did. It's a masterpiece." "Our masterpiece," Grace corrected, smiling up at him. "The first of many," Jackson promised, bending to kiss her softly. As if in agreement, the baby kicked sharply, making them both laugh. Jackson knelt to press a kiss to Grace's belly. "Patience, little one. You'll be here soon enough." Rising, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I had planned an elaborate proposal for this weekend. Dinner on the terrace, string quartet, the works. But seeing you standing here, in our home, I can't wait another moment." Grace's breath caught as Jackson opened the box to reveal a stunning emerald-cut diamond ring. "Grace Mitchell," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I've loved you since you fell asleep on my shoulder on a flight to Chicago. I want to build a life with you, a family, a future, a legacy that matters. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Grace's vision as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "yes." As Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger, the baby kicked again, a strong, decisive movement that made them both laugh through their tears. "I think that's a yes from both of us," Grace said, placing Jackson's hand over the spot. Jackson's smile was radiant as he pulled her close. "Our little traveler approves." Grace smiled at the words that had started their journey 7 months ago. Who would have thought that falling asleep on a billionaire's shoulder would lead her here, to a home filled with love, to a future brighter than any she could have designed on her own? Sometimes, she reflected, as Jackson's lips found hers again, the most beautiful journeys began with an unexpected connection and led to places you never imagined you'd go.